It sure looks like higher ed is going off the rails. At least the leading campuses are overtaken by these protest encampments. Jewish students are being targeted, and nobody seems ready to condemn antisemitism while also protecting free speech. But it looks like the problems go deeper, like the plagiarism that university faculty would never tolerate in their students. On other fronts, what's up with all these bans on lab-grown meat? And does the Biden administration understand how money works? We will discuss all this and more on today's episode of Independent Outlook. Hi, everybody. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you today from the Independent Institute in Oakland, California. Welcome to Independent Outlook, where we try to offer an independent take on the issues of the day. As always, I'm joined by my colleague, Phillip Magness, who is the David J. Thoreau Senior Fellow in Political Economy. Welcome, Phillip Magness.
Thanks for having me.
Great to see you. And also joined by my perennial partner in crime, Williamson Evers, who is a Senior Fellow here and also the Director of our Center on Educational Excellence. Hi, Bill. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
Great to see both of you. And I'm really delighted that we have many of our friends will be joining us to listen in on this conversation. And so let's just get going. What's going on campuses, and can the colleges figure out a way to condemn anti-Semitism without infringing free speech?
There's a real mess happening on campuses right now. And, as we've seen for the last several weeks, especially leading up into graduation, protesters that are protesting the war in Gaza, ostensibly, are setting up like occupation sites, setting up tent encampments in buildings and on the lawns of major elite institutions and universities around the country. And some of these encampments have gotten into conflicts with police coming in, trying to move them out, shut them down. They've also had some altercations where they've basically gotten to shouting matches and obstructed students from moving across the campus, from using buildings, going to classes, even attempts to disrupt commencement ceremonies. So it is a very strange and complex time to be in the university system. And it's occurring also at a moment when some of the rhetoric that's coming out of these protests is very highly inflammatory. We've heard anti-Semitism on open display, like people shouting, "Go back to Poland" to Jewish Americans.
That one's just stunning. The "go back to Poland"
absolutely.
is just stunning.
It's just over-the-top rhetoric on that. And then I think it's also overlaid with, and this is the point that I've noticed and made about several of these protests, the rhetoric is not just anti-Semitic, it's deeply steeped in this Marxian post-colonial narrative that basically paints Israel as the West and Gaza is the oppressed, colonized party in need of liberation. And basically they're using this as like a proxy to make an attack on Western capitalism more generally. So you see hammers and sickles all over the place at these protests. They're passing out copies of Das Kapital. They're shouting slogans that openly say that we're fighting for Gaza because we really want to tear down America and tear down capitalism. So it's a very, very strange movement that's emerged, but one that's wedded thoroughly and again intrinsically to radical socialistic Marxian philosophy.
Interestingly, a few weeks ago, I did an interview, which you helped me with, Phil, with Benjamin Ginsberg of Johns Hopkins University. It's available on our website. He wrote the book we just published on the New American Anti-Semitism, which is behind me on the shelf. And Ben Ginsberg argued along the same lines that what's weirdly happened is that Israel, and therefore Jewish people generally, have been identified as somehow embodying the oppressive capitalist, white, patriarchal, bourgeois, capitalist West, all the targets, of the leftist ideology, which is weird because Israel was actually among the more socialist of the Western countries.
It's a strange inversion here.
It's a really weird inversion.
Except that it's certainly the early political leaders of Israel and many of the most influential kibbutzim were socialist in ideology.
Sure.
Obviously, today, even though a lot of the institutions still survive from this more socialistic period, it's more of a normal European-style country in terms of its economy. But there's other peculiarities to all this. One is public universities have a somewhat different legal situation than private universities in terms of speech situation. So public universities, it's not a free-for-all. It's not anything can go on anywhere. Students can, disrupt classes or occupy buildings and things like that. But they have a broader speech that they need to allow in public universities. And again, private universities may have made contractual things as part of their admissions or other things where they have stated as policy on the university, speech codes, whatever, what the rules are, and they should be following those. And then there's upcoming questions about, so Phil and Graham have pointed out this back to Poland thing. That's clearly anti-Semitic, but it's not necessarily physically menacing and threatening. It might be. It depends a bit on the situation. But clearly, if you say, well, we're going to conduct an intifada against you, or the Holocaust should be redone against you, or October 7th should be done against you, that's actually physically menacing on either a private or public university.
I think there was a picture of one of these protesters holding a sign in front of some Jewish students, and it basically said, essentially, you're next. You're the next victim of another October 7th. That does come across as a threat.
That's a threat. Now, nonetheless, there are valid criticisms that people could make. Actually, it doesn't even matter if they're valid. There are criticisms that people will and do make against Israel, and that should be part of free speech.
Absolutely.
On the other hand, on a private university, let's say you're Brandeis or whatever, you might limit even that. I don't. But certainly in a public university, you could be criticizing Israel fairly or unfairly.
I think there's an interesting hypocrisy element here, because we've heard for the last decade or more, the campus left, the very same people that are cheering on these protests, have used extremely harsh, limiting definitions of free speech to shut down any political dissent from basically a far left perspective. Like they'll deem normal speakers and commentators from the political right as hate speech, and therefore
racist,
they need to be deplatformed, and they're not allowed on campus. And yet when it comes to this, they have an extremely expansive view of free speech that includes basically up to the line of calling for violence. And they're saying, well, that's protected by the First Amendment. And, I'm a First Amendment absolutist. I'd say that it's a very broad definition of what we permit under speech in our society, and it should be that way. But at the same time, you have to look at the inconsistency, the asymmetry of the way that these people are applying rules. They want one set of rules that gives them free rein to not only engage in some very violent-sounding speech, but then they'll turn around and they won't extend that to the other side. They won't extend that to anyone that criticizes them. And in fact, they're the first that will write them up for microaggressions or report them to one of these incident reporting systems that all these exact same campuses have set up to basically quiet any political dissent.
To suppress speech. So there's another interesting angle to this, and that is a lot of the symbolism in these demonstrations has been sort of pro-Hamas in a weird way. The outfits that people are wearing, some of these slogans and so forth. On the other hand, I had occasion to meet with some 1960s radicals recently, now like me in their mid to late 70s years old. And none of them, even though they were generally anti-Israel on anti-Zionist left-wing grounds back in the 1960s and still have that view today, none of them voiced any pro-Hamas or excusing things about October 7th, which I thought was an interesting thing for me to observe.
That is interesting.
Yeah, it is.
Bill, you pointed out to me this article, I think it was in the New York Times, by John McWhorter of Columbia University. Pretty fascinating. Here's just a brief excerpt from it. He said, what would have happened if protesters were instead chanting their anti-Semitic, anti-black slogans, rather.
Right.
Something like DEI has got to die to the same tune that's being sung from the river to the sea. They would have lasted roughly 5 minutes before masses of students shouted them down and drove them off campus.
And this is partly Phil's point about the hypocrisy.
Yeah. Imagine protesters blocking black students from accessing a classroom. We actually had that happen.
Or capturing them years ago. Capturing them in a library. Right.
But why is it okay now?
Graham is referring to Wallace and the high central, or Faubus maybe in the central high
Faubus,
school.
Right, yeah.
Right.
Why was it okay now but not okay then? One wants to know. Or vice versa.
Anyway, there's a lot of hypocrisy and a lot of evil going on here. On the other hand, Israel is hardly perfect historically, and even now, probably excessive. So you can have a just war in its beginning and, starting a just war, but you can also conduct a war disproportionately, and the critics of Israel are arguing that its response is disproportional. Israel is saying, well, the only way we can deal with this is to crush Hamas, and therefore we use these giant bunker-busting bombs that have a lot of civilian deaths associated with it. So that's the debate at the policy level anyway.
Well, on that point, but then there's the internal policy debate, which we were more focusing on a moment ago. And I wanted to come back to a point that Phil had put his finger on briefly, which is the distinction between public and private venues and so forth.
Right.
Many Americans actually have trouble getting their minds around this, which is to say, the First Amendment protects speech from being repressed by government. That's what the First Amendment protects. The First Amendment doesn't protect speech against social influence. The First Amendment doesn't, cover non-governmental actors. Now, what we're talking about in hypocrisy usually has to do with these institutions that subscribe to these claims of free speech and inclusion, but then in practice don't do it. The First Amendment does not forbid hypocrisy.
Right.
And so non-governmental institutions, of which there are many, they do have some leeway, more than a public institution, government institution would have, in setting the parameters of their tone. So I think that actually protecting free speech issues under the First Amendment is crucial, but at the same time, most of this issue has to do with inappropriate social pressure and influence and coercion rather than governmental. And so keeping these things straight is a little tricky sometimes, especially since apparently there are some now attempts to implement new laws to try and combat anti-Semitism. So now we're getting into the legal sphere where the power of the government is relevant. And so I am appalled at anti-Semitism and disgusted at the hypocrisy of the university administrators, but I'm not comfortable with these ideas of that we need new laws prohibiting anti-Semitism, because that could go wrong, couldn't it?
It's absolutely the case. I mean, the classical argument for free speech is to let truth and error collide in the public sphere. Let it be meted out. And, we have confidence in our ideas that we can triumph over hate. We can triumph over bigotry by making stronger arguments, by pointing out why it's wrong, showing disapprobation of these acts of really vile forms of speech. The way to combat them is to condemn them. If you try to come in and legislate that with the force of law, you're inviting the state to come in and determine which speech is permissible, which speech is not. And it turns out that's a lot more fluid than just saying, hey, we condemn hate. You have to always imagine these types of laws. What would they do in the hands of people that are opposed to you? What would, if the other side seized power or came into power through an election, how would they use those exact same laws?
Right. That's what
and
you have
I
to
don't
ask.
have confidence that they would do so impartially. I don't even have confidence that our own side would do so impartially.
Right.
So that's just not to legislate in that area.
So another aspect of this, there's a anti-Semitism law that's gone through the House. and it may or may not be taken up by the Senate. The one set of critics, so we just don't like them intervening at all in free speech. There's another set of people that say, well, they also have a very broad definition of what constitutes anti-Semitism, because they picked a definition that essentially encompasses all criticism of Israel as being anti-Semitic. And that, I mean, even many, anyway, that's just really crazy, okay?
But to what extent...
That would make President Biden in violation of this law.
It would. I mean, to what extent, though, has American law already crossed over this line and begun implementing laws against hate speech and hate crimes? Other countries have gone much further, but has American law already gone there, basically?
It actually hasn't. It hasn't. The Supreme Court has never recognized hate crime, although there are some, hate speech.
Right, speech.
They've never, hate crime still seems to be a thing. So you can commit murder, and you can have
there's actually an action
supposed hateful motive, and that can add to the penalty or the severity of your crime. But speech, you're still allowed to say things that a reasonable person would consider hate.
Allowed in the sense that the government is not going to stop you and shouldn't.
Right. Now, a private university might well not like you doing that.
There's a whole property rights issue here at the private universities.
Yeah, exactly.
That's one of the lines I think that's really coming out in these protests. Some of the protesters are saying they're invoking their free speech and saying our free speech is being violated. And then you ask, well, what type of speech are they engaged in? It's breaking into a building and setting up a tent encampment.
Right.
I mean, you don't have free speech to break into Walmart and set up a tent encampment in the shoe department. You don't have free speech to do the same thing to the Columbia Administration building.
And Hugo Black was a U.S. Supreme Court justice who was an absolutist on free speech. And he points out, you don't have a free speech right to come on my lawn with a megaphone and yell at me.
Right.
You're violating my property rights.
Yeah, that's extremely important. So the point is that keep in mind that the First Amendment says Congress, or now the states, shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. But with regard to these other matters, there's private associations, there's private property. Let's keep holding the line against hate speech laws, not because there isn't such a thing as hateful speech, but because the enforcement of it will be intrinsically problematic and skewed. I think that's the summary of what we're saying. Have I got that right, Phil?
I think that is a perfect way to summarize it.
There's more going wrong with higher education than these troubles here. And in fact, when I look at what you said earlier about how so much of this protest movement is really Marxist inspired and so forth, it's all about a cause which justifies almost any action. It reminds me of deeper issues that we've seen emerging in higher education. Well, let me just point to, for example, this really interesting article earlier this week in the Wall Street Journal, which is pointing out that a major publisher of academic journals, Wiley, which is a 217-year-old history books and journals, they're closing 19 of their academic journals because they were infected by large-scale research fraud carried out primarily by people credentialed and teaching at these major universities. How can there be 19 academic journals have to be closed because they're so badly infected? What's going on with the mindset of the academic world, which may actually have more long-term worrisomeness than this immediate stuff about protests? Can you comment, Phil, what's going on there?
Absolutely. There is a crisis of rigor in the academies today, and this includes all the way up to the top institutions, to the elite institutions. I mean, we saw the plagiarism case with Claudine Gay. We've seen several other major academic scandals at Ivy League and other elite schools. But this crisis is playing out precisely because there are collapsing mechanisms to check for rigor, to check for truth, to check for honesty in academic sources. And I think what you're seeing in the Wiley case, so they shuttered a bunch of journals basically because they found that the content these journals have been publishing for years after years after years is just fraud. They are made up articles. Some of them are AI generated. Other times they submit data sets that don't exist, that are like random number generators that you can do in Microsoft Excel. In other cases, they found instances of companies that are being paid to write fake articles that are just gibberish, nonsense, gobbledygook with a few graphs thrown on top of them. And they'll submit them to these very obscure, supposedly scholarly journals where almost no peer review is done. It's just rubber stamped and put into publication. And next thing you know, that professor gets to claim that publication as a line on their CV when they go up for tenure or for promotion. Part of this is the incentive structure of higher ed. We've set up higher ed to reward research output. You get promotion by the number of articles you publish and the venues you publish it in. And yet most of these articles are almost never read. Even in good, decent journals, it's a very small audience of niche academics that will ever read a piece that you publish. And when you get further down the list to like some of these journals that were shuttered, these are things that maybe over the course of 2 decades, they'll garner all of 5 citations, period. And yet they're being used for promotion decisions. So because of that incentive structure, there's no scrutiny on the rigor. There's no scrutiny on misconduct, outright misconduct, but there is a high career reward. So obviously, what do people do? They're going to cheat.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the part about, I don't object as much to the part about generating a whole bunch of dull, meaningless, unimportant stuff. But what really worries me is the fraud that's involved. I mean, you've uncovered some fraud, right, Phil?
That's absolutely the case. And you know, the Wiley example, they shut down what are probably pretty low quality journals or low ranked journals. I would argue the fraud actually extends much higher into the academy, and I've seen it firsthand. I've seen top journals in multiple disciplines publish work that should never have made it past the first round of peer review. Why? Because it promotes or supports a favored ideological narrative in the academic professions. Academia has shifted very hard to the left in the last 20 years, even to the point that most academic discussions at conferences and in the peer review processes of these entire fields are just echo chambers of 99% of the people agree on the exact same politics. And if you submit a subpar piece of research that confirms a bias that all of the other readers and peer reviewers already have, well, what happens? They're not inclined to open up the data file. They're not inclined to scrutinize the graphs. They aren't going to check the footnotes and citations to see if they're actually going to real sources as opposed to something I just made up. And as a result of that, there's basically a built-in bias in peer review that lets subpar work through without any scrutiny.
But Phil, isn't there at least a tiny reason for optimism in that this is getting found out?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And, you know, we think back to the Belial book on colonial era gun control and how that was exposed as being extremely shoddy, if not fraudulent research. I would say it looks like it was fraudulent research. And other cases, certainly in social psychology, there's been a massive exposure of problematic supposedly scholarly literature. That whole field is really in shambles in many ways.
Behavioral economics, the same thing.
Yes, behavioral economics, another field that's just in shambles. So while it's disgusting and horrible to look at, the good news is that there is something in the process of science and the process of scholarship where, you know, if you can't replicate, by the way, in my field of education, there's a big problem on replication because when a person writes an article, they draw on schools. Okay, so they're saying, well, we tried this curriculum or this teaching a method or something like that in the school, and we got better results. But they write secrecy agreements, or the university on its human subjects review panel makes them write agreements with the schools saying never to be revealed who the school is and what exactly the data is and so forth. So if a critic of the article in the education field wants to see, well, did that really work? They can't get the original data. They can't go back to the schools. They can't look at the testing results that might be public because they can't find out what the school is. Now, people try through back formation to figure it out still, but it's very difficult. And it means that, not that anybody had a lot of confidence in education
even to begin with
anyway, but it's extremely problematic in terms of this replication issue.
Absolutely. It's the same fields that were already on shaky ground are now being exposed in very public ways, and it's damaged the reputation of higher education in general.
It really has. Yeah, it really has. And I had a fascinating conversation earlier this week with a man who teaches at Stanford, and he trotted out to me his sort of left-wing bona fides. He was against the Vietnam War in March and et cetera, all the stuff that but he said he's been stunned at the closure, ideological closure that has now taken over Stanford and other universities in so many ways. And he was puzzling his head over it. My own theory is that starting in the 1970s, in philosophy departments and related fields, the doctrines of postmodernism began to be propounded. There's no facts, no truth. Every apparent effort to find out the facts and the truth is really, supposedly, according to that doctrine, just a concealed version of an attempt to gain power.
Exactly.
All there's no such thing as objective fact-finding and truth-seeking, and so it's all just power. And if that's true, then the result that follows is not, oh, we should all be tolerant. No, what follows logically from that is we should just go for what we want.
Yeah.
We should push our own preferences. And so you see preference pushing is taking over from actual science and research.
Yeah. Well, it's a shift toward activism as the primary
Yes.
mission of the university. And you see this in survey after survey. They've asked the opinion of faculty, what is your purpose in the classroom? And if you go back even 20 or 30 years ago, a majority of them would say to disseminate knowledge, to teach, to cultivate learning, all of the things that the public is sold on when we're asked to invest in higher education. If you ask them today, it's upwards of
it's public engagement.
Exactly. It's upwards of 80% of professors will say, well, my purpose in the classroom is to teach students how to be activists.
Yikes. Right. Phil, which famous personage said, the point is not to understand the world, but to change it?
Karl Marx said it. Karl Marx said it.
That's where this all comes from. It's critical theory, the notion of the oppressed versus the oppressor. And when you put yourself into that mindset, it's just exactly what Graham was saying a minute ago. Any and every tactic becomes permissible on the table to overthrow the oppressor. And we see this in the Gaza protest, people on campus. They're rooted in post-colonial theory. This is Franz Fanon and Edward Said and some of these theorists that came out of the 20th century adopting a Marxian framework to basically argue and justify and legitimize violence as a means of overthrowing power that you see as unjust. But you also see it in the academic presses. They'll say, we're going to decolonize the journals. And what that really means, if you hear an editor saying we're decolonizing the journals, that means we're throwing out all standards of evidence, of fact.
That's what it means, exactly.
And just opening the floodgates to basically fraudulent, low quality, low rigor research that happens to confirm our political beliefs.
But you know what's scary? Let me just add one thought, Bill, before you go ahead, if you permit me. What's scary, though, is that the doctrine that there's no truth is, although it may have emanated on the left, starting when I said, it's been absorbed so widely. And if those on the other side have also absorbed the doctrine that there is no truth and that therefore anything is justified, that would mean logically that those who oppose all this left-wing stuff may end up feeling very empowered to do whatever it takes, using any kind of force or violence to suppress the left-wing stuff. And that's terrifying too.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well,
you're opening Pandora's box.
We see that in some of the post-communist countries of Eastern Europe. that instead of turning to being a free society with a liberalized civil society and economy, they've come to be repressive. And some of our initial optimism about how those countries would turn out is turning to be not what could have been hoped for. I don't want to make a kind of a quibble, because I am a political theorist by my original scholarly training. And we call these things Marxist kind of loosely.
Yes. Yeah.
Nationalistic identity theory is not something that Marx would have embraced himself, or Engels. Their argument was that the industrial proletariat of the world would rise up, not that different national identity groups would rise up. And they opposed. So one of the things is that Marx and Engels thought that Hungary should be annihilated as a people because they were reactionary and engaging in nationalistic rebellion.
Yes.
So it's fine, I think, kind of loosely talk about this, but we're also scholars of PhDs. And so I think it's better to say leftist rather than Marxist when we're characterizing these things.
Point taken. I'm going to change the subject, if you don't mind, gentlemen.
No, please.
Totally change it. Let's talk about the question that's kind of front and center of U.S. politics right now. What, if any, immunity should a president or a former president have? And is this being discussed in the courts, Phil Evers?
Yes, it is. And so it's not so much front and center in the New York City hush money case, but it is in the other cases. So the question is something along the following lines. When you're the president, you do various things, some of which might, if you were just a regular person, subject you to a civil suit or to a criminal suit. So back in the days of Richard Nixon, a libertarian who had been involved in Pentagon procurement, a man named Ernest Fitzgerald, sued Nixon in a civil matter, and the courts held that the president had immunity. So, and this immunity would persist after he left office. So then the question is, okay, as it comes up in the Trump case, they're alleging various criminal acts on his part, and his defense team is arguing that a president should have absolute immunity for what he does. And then some commentators are saying, well, that's too extreme. The classic case of the president, going off and murdering somebody, and a video of it, can't really have that. So maybe it's a narrower thing. Maybe we're going to have it be this is really what it also was in the Fitzgerald case. If we go to the most expansive perimeter of presidential executive branch actions, he's immune within that.
Yeah.
And then there's also the prosecution is saying, well, he's not immune at all. So libertarians, so you could be some kind of constitutionalist and say the president should have some kind of immunity like this within the perimeters of the outer reaches of executive action. You could also be a kind of quite strict libertarian and say, the president is really like everybody else. And actually maybe the Ernest Fitzgerald case, giving him immunity from civil suits in most cases, and what many commentators want to give Trump, this immunity within this, maybe that's wrong. Maybe the president should be treated just like everybody else and not be able to do civil injuries or criminal injuries. And so this is what's before the court, and they're probably going to decide that the president has limited immunity within some sphere which they will have to define, and whether or not that's alleged in these criminal indictments against him fall within or without. We'll have to see when the court decides, which they will decide in June.
I don't want presidents to be all tied in knots so they can't do their job, though, because of threat of liability.
So you're in that constitutionalist position.
Yeah.
But some people, for example, Ivan Eland, who's our colleague at the Independent Institute, say, well, if presidents attack American civilians without going through criminal proceedings and kill them, they should be indicted.
Yeah.
If
we had a case like that under Obama.
He brings out 3 or 4 of these, and the point is, they are all depend on the details. If you're going to allow some immunity, then it depends on the details. But it does look like presidents in the past, particularly in the foreign policy area, have done things that a general really couldn't do, and that they're not part of a congressional declaration of war. So the president is going beyond his commander-in-chief authority under wartime conditions. And so Ivan says, hey, we should not be giving the presidents a blank check.
What do you think, Phil? You want to comment?
Yeah, well, this is a tricky area of law that goes all the way back to the doctrines of medieval England, and the notion that the king is the sovereign and the king speaks for the state, basically.
But our argument is the people is the sovereign.
Exactly. But it's the same notion that's at play. This follows down from law, and I do happen to think that probably saying absolute immunity for the sovereign is way too far on the other side.
Right.
But we see this in cases like when
he's not the sovereign.
Exactly.
Okay.
He thinks he is, but
that could be the case, but he is not under American jurisprudence and political culture.
Yeah, but look at so when police forces engage in abuse, they often invoke these same immunity actions, saying, well, we can't be brought up on charges of assault and battery because we were subduing a suspect.
Right.
And then there's some rationale behind that yes, the police have to use force to capture someone who is fleeing a murder scene or something like that. But then it gets into a fuzzy line when they start using excessive force to subdue a nonviolent person in a traffic stop. And we've seen multiple cases of that.
Taken overboard, way overboard.
Taken way over on the other side. But then what happens is they're investigated. You can't indict the police officer because they'll invoke immunity. Now, expand that all the way up to the presidential level, you start to see how complicated this gets very, very quickly. And I think what we have in the Trump case is we're talking about a doctrine of immunity that is often invoked in the foreign policy arena. It's often invoked for large presidential decisions. Trump's opponents, for a variety of reasons, have also said, well, we can invoke this on all sorts of every level of petty crime or petty impropriety, petty immorality, all the way down to what Trump does on his campaign, which is the current case.
Well, take the efforts that Trump made to challenge the 2020 election.
Exactly.
So he and his defense team can argue, well, my job, according to the Constitution, is to take care that the laws are effectively carried out. So part of the laws have to do with election integrity, and I was looking into that, and that is my job. And his opponents say, no, you are interfering with an election. And so, it seems to me that a number of commentators, particularly in the Wall Street Journal opinion columns, have argued that calling the Georgia Secretary of State and saying, are you sure you got the numbers right? You sure there's not 200 or 20,000 or 5,000 or whatever number is that lying around somewhere and you haven't noticed it? He didn't say, make it up, create it.
He said, find me a certain number of votes.
Okay, but
Well, who
that's
does he
not
think he is? He's Lyndon
necessarily.
Johnson here.
Lyndon Johnson found a lot of boxes of votes in Wells County, box 13. So anyway, the point is this has to be carefully looked at. And it's not just, oh, Trump bad, Orange Man bad. Many times Orange Man bad, but not every time. We have to judge it on the merits.
Yeah. And bad doesn't necessarily mean illegal either.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes,
You got a hypocrisy element. Because, I look at a lot of the things that Trump did in contesting the election, and I object to them for a variety of reasons. I think he was probably on an unfounded basis to do what he did. But at the same time, the Democrats did the same thing 2 cycles before that and 3 cycles before that.
Yeah.
I also think there's
American
one ground which Speaker Mike Johnson was a spear point on, where the Trump people, even though they didn't argue this very well or in a timely fashion or whatever, the Constitution requires that the state legislature make changes in federal election procedures. And in a number of states, and it's, question of whether this made a difference in the election and the totals and so forth. But in a number of states, that's not what happened. The state legislature did not make a decision. Yeah. It was made administratively or in the judiciary, and that is against the U.S. Constitution. And the Trump people, they never carried it out, but Johnson tried to push that and said, we don't have to find physical examples of fraud, which of course after election are really hard to find anyway. We can look at the fact that they did that. Now, there's an additional problem is, let's say they did in Pennsylvania carry out the election. Well, what do you do? What's the remedy?
What's the remedy?
Exactly. Do you run the election again? Do you exclude Pennsylvania from the electoral college totals?
That would be a great abuse.
I don't know if it is. If they were cast illegitimately and unconstitutionally, what is the remedy other than that, Graham?
Well, there isn't a remedy, I'm afraid.
Okay. So anyway, the problem is there.
Yeah.
Go back to 1876. We had that situation.
The Trump people said, well, we'll put up parallel electors, or we'll ask Pence to not certify certain states until things have been carried out. The Kennedy people running against Nixon in Hawaii, they also had alternative electors. It's not obvious.
There's a long history of this.
Yes, it's not obvious. If you have total Trump derangement syndrome, yes, this is the most sinister thing since Mussolini took over Italy. But part of the problem is that there aren't good legal remedies and there aren't good electoral integrity procedures in place in many of these cases. And so while the Trump people may have handled it wrongly, it's hard to exactly tell them what they should have done differently.
Exactly.
Certainly during all that controversy, one lesson learned would have been, if the state legislature's jurisdiction over such matters was in fact infringed, the legislatures should be taking darn well sure to fix that.
But what if they're a Democratic state? Let's say one house or both houses of the legislature are run by Democrats, and the governor's a
minority
Democrat,
have standing then,
or the judges are Democrats, and they do this, and then the legislature just shuts up because they don't care. It's not obvious.
No.
I will say the following. Bill Barr, in speeches and in his book, his memoirs, says the real tactical or whatever error was that Trump did not have a dedicated legal team to watch this and, crack down on these abuses where the states were not doing the constitutional thing. And they didn't have it because they were sloppy.
New topic. Let's talk about the Biden administration economic team.
Oh boy.
Does the Biden economic team understand how money works?
I am very skeptical and dubious that they understand much of anything about economics in general. And this has been a problem deeper than just the most recent incident, which is Jared Bernstein, who's the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, basically flubbed this interview that he gives on the functions of the Federal Reserve, and doesn't really understand how money is created, doesn't really understand the monetary levers that the Fed uses for open market operations, and just kind of stumbled. So it's but I think it's symptomatic of a deeper problem in the Biden economic team. And I contrast it even to someone like Barack Obama. So Obama was certainly governed from the left of center, certainly made his appointments from people on the left, but he picked an economic team that tended to be mainstream center-left Keynesians. I disagree with their policy prescriptions, but they at least have a basis of knowledge in economics.
And they had PhDs in economics.
Absolutely.
Now tell us about Jared Bernstein's academic background.
So he has an academic background in music and social work, I believe, are the degrees that he's.
That's right.
So now he writes on economic policy, and I imagine
he's
in certain areas
he's a fluent writer. He's a fluent writer. There's no doubt about it.
But at the same time, it's like, well, why is this the front and center representative of the Biden economic team? And you look at the Council of Economic Advisors, it's a similar pattern. They have people that have PhDs from these really obscure, heterodox places like the New School, places that teach modern monetary theory and post-Keynesian economics and Marxist economics, things that are considered the outer fringes of the discipline, have been elevated and pushed into the center. And you see this in the Biden policy prescriptions. You see it in the commentary in this flubbed interview. You see it in Biden administration officials endorsing modern monetary theory, which we can get into. You see it in Biden administration officials adopting this notion that inflation that we experienced over the last 2 years was a result of corporate greed. Like the corporation suddenly decided to get greedy and charge more for gasoline and eggs and chicken at the grocery store. That's not the mechanism that causes inflation. And yet this weird fringe crackpot theory from the outer boundaries of the discipline started being championed by the White House because they do not have the mainstream expertise in their own ranks to even competently comment on major economic issues.
Phil, I think you owe our viewers a very encapsulated, short description of modern monetary theory and how absurd it is.
Oh, where to start? I actually call it postmodern monetary theory, which I think is a more accurate descriptor. It's this notion that the government can utilize and employ its position as a monopolist creator of currency to basically print money and fund anything and everything it wants. It kind of burst out of the periphery of some really heterodox branches of economics over the past 20 or 30 years, although it's an old theory that goes back to like crackpot stuff from the 19th century, if you dig deep. But the idea is that government should use its power over the currency to basically intentionally exploit and turn on the printing press, and we can fund anything and everything we want, from the Green New Deal to massive social and jobs programs to war to whatever you name it.
And there won't be any bad effects that can't be overcome by printing more money.
Exactly. So they're throwing out the notion that that there's a link between this printing of money and inflation, which is just absurd. And they actually say, well, they invert the powers of the monetary and fiscal agents of the government. They say that monetary policy is predominantly a fiscal phenomenon where we can spend as much as we want as long as we exercise control over the tax mechanism. So taxes are the only brake they really have on inflationary pressures from printing a bunch of money. They basically write the Federal Reserve out of the process and invert its role, which is unfortunately what came through in this documentary. I think it was actually financed by the modern monetary theory people when they did this interview that he flubbed. And so they're very much pushing this line to try to get prominent top officials, economic officials of the government, to stumble their way backward into modern monetary theory as an official policy position. And unfortunately, it seems that they found a sucker. They found someone that did that for them.
Exactly.
Thank you for that nutshell summary, Phil. It's
postmodern monetary theory.
Yeah, postmodern monetary theory. Very, very troubling. But it fits in with what we were saying earlier. if you've been steeped in this idea that really all knowledge is just kind of, it's pushing a bias of one kind or another, then you excuse everything. But at this point, when they're adopting postmodern monetary theory, this is affecting everyone, millions and millions of people, by the degradation of the currency.
It's funny also that Biden said several times, well, when I came into office, inflation was at 9% instead of 1.4 or 1.2 or something like that. And yes, the rate of inflation has declined some, but the effect of all that inflation is still there, and that's what the public doesn't like.
Absolutely. You're in double-digit losses of purchasing power since Biden took office.
Yikes.
And it's really concentrated at things that we feel. It's menu prices. It's the drive-through line at McDonald's. It's the grocery store. This is where the hit has been occurring, and it's affecting everyone's paychecks. I mean, we did get it somewhat tamped down because the Federal Reserve finally started engaging in countervailing measures after delaying and saying, hey, this was transitory. If you remember that line, they used that for several months as inflation is going through the roof, and they said they did almost nothing and said, hey, it's transitory, it'll go away. Turns out it doesn't go away until you actually started raising the discount rate to countervail the pressures that had come from a spending problem.
Both Trump and
Biden spending problem.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Trump at least had a sort of an excuse that the COVID was going on.
Yeah.
It was already waning away by the time Biden did these massive spending.
And ramped it back up, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to change the topic yet again. I'm actually I always follow what Governor DeSantis of Florida is doing. He's pretty interesting. I've actually defended him in writing on one occasion. And so recently when I saw that he shares my aversion to fake meat, lab-grown meat, I thought, okay, yeah, go Governor DeSantis. But then it turns out apparently what he's doing, he's not just like complaining about fake meat. He's actually banning fake meat.
And also Governor Ivey of Alabama, too.
Yeah, right. So I think it's disgusting. The concept is disgusting, but is a legal ban on it the best approach to solve the problem?
Yeah. So I have my skepticism on the legal ban issue. I think it's actually kind of a redundant measure. I mean, part of me looks at this and sees these fake meat industries very much do have an ideological agenda. They're tied to the climate change crowd. They're tied to like the militant political forms of veganism. The people that go in and throw food dye and chemicals in the grocery store and vandalize things. All of the fake meat industry because they're trying to implement policies that shift the world's diet. So I am sympathetic to disliking the fake meat industry, but at the same time, I don't think there's a market for this stuff. I think most people have the reaction that the three of us probably do. You're fake meat grown in a test tube. It's like, ooh, that's kind of gross. And what kind of chemicals and all sorts of other things are going into the production of these processes? Now, maybe there are eccentric people that try it, and the same's true of like these artificial vegetable burgers that are just congealed chemicals holding binding agents, holding cellulose together. It's just utterly disgusting to me, and yet it's being sold. I don't think there's a market for it because we see this pattern play out in the other fake meat companies. That they made a big splash, invested all this money in it, and they put it on the grocery stores and they put it on the menus, and then it turns out actually nobody's buying it. I argue that this is a form of economic activity I'd refer to as conspicuous production. Companies
I've heard of conspicuous consumption, but
consumption, This is like a counterpart. So conspicuous consumption, that was Thorsten Veblen's term for, you buy a fancy watch and a flashy car to show off to your neighbors that
your
you
status. Your status.
Conspicuous production would be companies carry products to show that they're environmentally conscious,
right? Mm-hmm.
To show that they are they care about the earth, or that they're investing in green products, and that's where all this the fake meat, both the lab grown stuff and then the congealed vegetable binding agent stuff comes from, is they think other people want to see this and get good vibes, good feels by seeing it in the grocery store, but no one wants to eat it because it apparently tastes terrible.
So, I know people like this. They go to Whole Foods and they see this kind of thing on the shelves and they think, oh, I'm the kind of person who shops at a store which has this kind of product. I'm not going to buy it, but I feel good about myself at shopping in a store which has this stuff.
Yeah, but I never buy it, but I see the display.
Right. And I'm patting myself on the back because I shop at that kind of store, but I'm not buying the product.
Exactly.
It's symbolic signaling. You're
Exactly.
100%.
Yeah. So, I'm sympathetic with the idea, like, hey, let's swat this thing down. But isn't the law like
it's unnecessary?
It's unnecessary, and it's too blunt an instrument to swat this kind of silliness down. Let it just be silliness, That's
Well,
what I think.
I'm gonna say one other thing, and that is, we shouldn't be opposed to inventions in the food industry.
Sure. Yeah, right.
I mean, the fact is, people are gonna maybe go to the moon or be rotating in outer space or various things. And also, we might have plagues that attack animals or attack vegetables or whatever, and we might want to have science and technology that allows flexibility to mankind to cope with these things. And we shouldn't just say innovation. We should we should let the market try this out and let science and technology explore it, and bans block that.
This has been a pretty interesting conversation, gentlemen. Thank you very much. I often like to give you an opportunity to make your last pithy comment on the topic of the day. I think I'll start with Phil in just a minute. Is there anything that you'd particularly like to point out to us that we haven't yet covered?
Well, I think we've covered quite a bit of territory. I would say, make note of this theme of postmodernism. It's run through the university protests and some of the problems on campus, to the decline in the journal standards, to postmodern monetary theory, the way that this is intruded into the public space. I'd say this is symptomatic of a broader problem, and that problem is exactly what we've talked about. It's the jettisoning of truth and evidence and factuality in favor of just an activist cause. Then anything and everything goes as long as it pursues that activist cause, because you think that your side's in the right and the other side's in the wrong. You're the oppressed, they're the oppressor. Therefore, you can do anything that you want and need to overthrow the oppressor. As soon as society goes down that direction, it's like all rules are off.
That's right.
It's an open season game. And that's a very dangerous place to be in, because normally it means violence follows. Normally it means that collapses of basic mechanisms that hold society together follow.
Bill Evers, parting thought.
Well, I'm going back to the Trump and presidential immunity, and obviously it includes previous presidents also. And I can remember saying to my wife when we heard Trump supporters chanting "lock her up" about Hillary Clinton, saying, do we want to be in a banana republic where each successor regime sues and jails the predecessor regime?
Yeah.
On the other hand, do we want to be in a situation where presidents can do whatever they want with no legal accountability? So this is a difficult path to thread, and we're going through it. When we were recording this, the trial against Trump in Manhattan in the so-called hush money case seems to be collapsing for the prosecution. Their effort to use testimony from Michael Cohen to tie Trump into the decision to pay the Trump money, the hush money, seems to have collapsed on cross-examination. Obviously this trial is by no means over. It has some days to still continue. But it's revealing the problems of one party that goes after another candidate. And I don't know what the political consequences are going to be in the long run, we have to hope that the Trump people, if they get in office, don't proceed to sue every Democrat in the country. I mean, it's this whole lawfare thing is potentially very ugly. On the other hand, we have to be troubled with the thought that no president can get away with doing anything.
Right.
And so this is the thing I ask our viewers to think about in their minds as to how this is proceeding.
Thank you both. And I also want to thank the many people who join us in our audience watching Independent Outlook. I've met many of you actually in person, and so I know we've got friends who pay attention. Thanks for keeping up with us, friends. And let me remind you that you can always turn to our website, independent.org, for a lot of fresh and interesting insights on the events of the day. And you can always go deeper, too. We have a lot of deeper studies that can help you sort things out. We do our best to keep you informed. So thanks for joining us here at Independent Outlook. We'll see you next time.